Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the founder and CEO of ICv2. It's Milton Griepp. Thanks for coming on, Milton.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So before we get started on like a 10,000-foot view of the comic industry right now, which is really why I wanted to have you on, I want to talk about your past a bit to lay down the groundwork of who you are so listeners know why it's important, to take heed to your word. So I want to start with your beginning in comic distribution. I know this wasn't actually your very beginning, but you were the co-founder of Capital City Distributors, one of the multiple comic book distributors that existed before it was just Diamond, in 1980 when you were just 26. That is, I don't know. I mean, that's not a usual thing to get into when you're 26. Why was that something you wanted to get into?
Well, it was sort of the result of jobs I had starting in grad school, working in distribution. My first job in comic distribution was in 1976, and it was with something that was popular in Madison at the time, which was a co-op. And it was a distribution co-op that handled magazines, underground comics, and trade paperbacks, a few hardcovers, and sold them to food co-ops, record stores, head shops, sort of the counterculture distribution network. And they were handling underground comics, and were about to get into mainstream Marvel and DC comics when they hired me. And I knew something about that business because my roommate in college had brought me along as a helper at conventions. And he was buying comic collections and taking them to comic conventions. And so I had a little experience in that business and got hired in that first distribution job, then worked for Big Rapids for a while. And then when they went out of business, we started Capital City Distribution.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that a lot of people, especially like current fans of comics, don't realize is that, I mean, in the era before Diamond, there wasn't just like one or two distributors. There was a lot of distributors. Like you mentioned Big Rapids. I read Comic Shop, Dan Garino's book that you were a part of. And like the list and the stories of the varying distribution houses, like it would really shock people because it used to be so much bigger.
Well, yeah, they were between 15 and 20 probably at the peak. And that was sort of reflective of the overall magazine and book distribution business, which was much less consolidated than it is now. There were over 100 magazine distributors around the country and a lot more book distributors. So that was fairly typical of the time, and the consolidation in the comic distribution business was one part of the overall consolidation of the print distribution business, which happened in the 90s and aughts.
Mm-hmm. I do, this is a common refrain for me on this podcast, but I often say that comics often feels like it's this really special industry that doesn't have any commonality with everybody else. But, consolidation, like I'm not saying that Diamond being the only one doing it is a normal thing, but consolidation is something that's happened more in print. Like look at the airline industry. It used to be there's so many regional airliners, and now there's really like 6 total airlines in America, more or less, like prominent ones at least. So it is kind of funny. Like I think that the comic industry isn't quite as special in the consolidation regard as people really think it is.
Well, not at the distribution level, certainly. Distribution is a scale business. There's certain fixed costs, trucks, warehouses, IT, that every distributor needs. And if you have smaller sales, it's harder to cover those capital costs. Right. So it's a scale business, and the bigger you are, the more successful you can be.
So at one point, though, Capital City was actually the biggest distributor in all of comics. But during the 90s, in the time that people called the distributor wars, Diamond acquired Capital City in 1996. I know that was definitely, obviously, it was an interesting time for you, but I'm kind of curious on your perspective. Like, what was the long-term costs to the industry because of that consolidation that took place in the 90s? And what were the benefits?
I think the benefits, Diamond's been stable, and that 15, 20-year period before Diamond wrapped up the industry was extremely volatile. I mean, distributors were coming and going, people were going out of business, there was bad debt left behind. So Diamond brought stability, and that was a positive, especially at a time in the mid-'90s when the industry was shrinking. Mm-hmm. There were fewer comics being sold. So everybody was on a down cycle, and there was a lot of risk in the business. And so they eliminated some of that, and they've been stable and done a good job of getting comics to stores for that whole period since. So I think that's been a real positive of the Diamond consolidation. I would say in general, consolidation produces less innovation. Competitors are always trying things. There's more likelihood to try something that's maybe a little riskier, a little different if there's more competition. So I think that's maybe slowed the pace of change a little bit. On the negative side, when change is negative, slowing the pace of change is a good thing. And sometimes, though, you miss opportunities.
Yeah, I was actually kind of thinking about that as I was preparing for this because, there certainly hasn't been any push for Diamond to make any changes because it doesn't have any real competitors. Although it is kind of getting interesting because I know, particularly on the book side of things, like Diamond Book Distributors is not getting all of the business anymore. Like a lot of, like Oni Press, for example, a publisher I really enjoy, it goes through, I believe, Simon & Schuster now. And so there is more competition, I guess, on the graphic novel side than there used to be in the trade paperback side. And I wonder if that is going to lead to a little bit more push for innovation or push for change, at least.
Well, I think that is a place where there's competition, which is book distribution and book wholesaling.
Mm-hmm.
And just to clarify for people, book distributors are generally referred to, or you generally use book distributor as a term to refer to a company that buys from the publisher and maybe sells to wholesalers and retailers. So, Penguin Random House Publisher Services is a book distributor. It's a division of Penguin Random House, which is a publisher. They distribute Penguin Random House books, but they also distribute books from other companies. Then there's wholesalers like Ingram and Baker and Taylor, and their whole business is buying from distributors or publishers and selling to retailers. And so there's kind of two different layers there. And there is definitely competition now for retailer business, comic retailer business on books because those companies that are very good at distributing books are running up against Diamond, which is very good at distributing comics. They have different skill sets, and some retailers prefer, buying from one or the other. So there is competition there, and there is the potential for change.
Mm-hmm. I think that one thing that people forget about that whole period where there was a lot more than just one distributor, like take for example, like when Marvel went to Heroes World, which is a very notable time in comic book history, just because it was kind of a silly move, and that opened up a period where shops had to order, if they wanted to get Marvel, they had to order through Heroes World, and if they wanted to get DC, they had to go through Diamond, and then you had a lot of different small publishers at Capital City. One of the things that makes it tricky is like it's tough for retailers to go through the order process for one, even today. It's even tougher when you start adding other layers in there. It's like, a good example is like TKO. TKO just opened up and they're doing self-distribution. But one of the tricky things is now that opens another channel that shops are going to have to order through if they want to get TKO comics. Like there's a cost there, at least in time.
Well, and comic retailers are the busiest people in the world.
Mm-hmm.
They work really hard. They work incredible hours. And every supplier, as you say, adds a cost. And it's not just placing the order. It's also checking in a separate shipment, putting it on the shelf separately from the other shipment, paying the bill. All of those steps take time. And for especially smaller retailers, they just don't have the time to add a supplier. So I think in the case of TKO, that's going to limit some of their opportunities because there are some retailers that just won't pick them up because they can't afford the time to deal with another supplier.
Yeah. So just a few more questions before we get into the current state of things. But what, you look back at the 90s and it's this really dark period when people, I don't know, people look back at it as like this horrible, horrible time in comics. But I'm kind of curious, like, what do you think the biggest misconception about that period was? Or like what that has led to in the comic industry, I guess?
Well, I don't know about misconceptions. I think one of the biggest lessons was that you can't build a business solely on collectability. And I don't know that that's a lesson that's been well learned by a lot of the people that are currently in the comics business, but it just was a matter of degree, and it got to the point where so much of comic production was related to how can we make this comic unique and more collectible rather than how can we make people want to read it. So I think that's one part of it that I like to emphasize. I think another part of it is just that it's really hard to create comics that people want to read all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've seen in my career is there's periods when creativity ebbs and flows. And when all of a sudden, like mid-'80s, everything was running hot. You had Watchmen and Dark Knight and all these incredible, creative achievements that we still sell today and enjoy today. And sometimes that just doesn't happen. The magic doesn't happen. And that's a combination of a bunch of factors which are very difficult to control. Obviously, if it was easy to publish hit comics, everybody would do it all the time, but it's really hard. So I think one of the perceptions is it was all about, these collectability issues or people not focusing on the content. And I think that overlooks the fact that it's just really hard to make content that people enjoy. And sometimes you just don't have the magic, and that was happening then.
Mm-hmm. It is kind of funny, though, because that was a very dark time. It is impossible to ignore that. But like this year's number one selling trade paperback was actually from the 90s. It was the Infinity Gauntlet. It was, or at least in the direct market, it was that came out in 1993, and obviously it had a bit of a performance enhancer behind it with Infinity War coming out. But it is kind of funny that even today, like things like the Infinity Gauntlet or Watchmen or Dark Knight are still selling huge numbers every single year.
Good stuff keeps selling, and that's sort of the measure of quality, at least from my perspective, because I'm a sales-oriented person or a business-oriented person. Something that continues to sell for a long period of time, it's very, very rare. I used to quote in distribution the Theodore Spurgeon quote, which I'm paraphrasing, which said something to the effect of 90% of everything is crap. And it's actually a much higher percentage. 95% of the stuff that comes out, you're never going to hear about again. Nobody's ever going to care about it. And if people do continue to care about it or go back to it 20 years later, as happened with those Starlin books from the 90s, you can be assured that there's some good quality there.
Mm-hmm. All the stuff that happened in the 90s, I think, if you look at it from an outsider's perspective, it easily could have led to some hard feelings with you. But I'm kind of curious, did you ever contemplate getting out of comics at all? Because it seems like you didn't really ever.
After we sold Capital, I was looking at logistics, which was one of the skill sets that I had developed at Capital. We had really cutting-edge logistics. We were doing high-speed cross-docking, which was right at the cutting edge of logistics at the time. So we'd pick up stuff at the printer in Southern Illinois at midnight, and that stuff would be on sale in California at noon.
Wow.
We were moving stuff really fast. So I was very good at that kind of stuff, and we developed a lot of new systems that weren't in wide use at the time. And so I did look around at those, but nothing just quite gave me the same excitement or rewards that I got out of the comics business. So I kept getting pulled back. I kept trying to leave, but they kept pulling me back.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that the perspective you bring is very atypical in comics. Like I was going to ask about ICv2, which for listeners that don't know is your website, the business of geek culture, where you cover comics, not just comics, but you also cover tabletop gaming and surrounding adjacent lines. And that was kind of in a way, I don't know, is it fair to call it an expansion of the newsletter you used to do, Internal Correspondence?
Well, that's what it's named for. It's Internal Correspondence version 2. That's where ICv2 comes from.
Right. But I mean, is it? I never had a chance to read the initial Internal Correspondence. Is it kind of like a continuation of what you were doing there, just expanded?
Well, yes and no. There's certainly some things that are similar, and I think part of that is sort of a an indicator of some of the things that were developed in the 80s and 90s that are still in use today. So, for example, ICv2 does a lot of coverage of the numbers and what's selling. And that was something that we pioneered at Capital City in the pages of internal correspondence. We were the first ones to publish our bestseller list and indexes to show how they were selling in relation to each other. At the time, we used X-Men. When Diamond copied that, year or two later, they started using Batman, so they'd have something different. They still use Batman today. So that focus on numbers and what's selling, we always thought that was extremely valuable to retailers, because if they knew what was selling nationwide, they could look at their store and say, well, why am I not selling this product that's selling for everybody else? Or, what am I doing for this product that I'm doing so well with here that other people aren't having that same success with? So they can learn from what other people are selling and do a better job in their own stores. So that's an example, I think, of how there's continuity. And then just covering the business aspect. That was something I always enjoyed a lot at Capital. I wrote for the magazine we did there, and covering that behind-the-scenes business of comics and related businesses, because we also covered at Capital tabletop games and trading cards. And so I think part of the concept was business news for retailers. Another part of the concept was that retailers typically don't carry just one category. And at the time when we started ICv2, we were calling it the pop culture store. Now we call it the geek culture store. But almost all of them have at least a handful of products from the other categories. So covering the news across categories is definitely something we do from internal correspondence.
Man, the geek culture. Oh God, I have to ask. This is not something I wanted to talk about initially, but are you kind of shocked by how pervasive geek culture has come since the initial internal correspondence? Because last night I was playing a video game. I was playing Overwatch on my Xbox, and I was talking to some guy, and he asked what I was doing, and I told him I was working on editing a podcast because I'm very good at multitasking. And this guy, another person we were playing with, messaged me, and he's like, "Do you like Funko Pop?" And I was like, "What? This is so random." And it is kind of funny when I guess when I was a kid and I was growing up in Alaska with no friends who read comics or were interested in comics, to think of a time when geek culture is so pervasive was just so unbelievable. I would never have believed it in 1994. Is it kind of shocking to you, or is it you've just been so immersed in it, it just kind of feels a natural progression?
Well, it is a natural progression, and I feel like the distribution network and the stores were a big part of that conversion of geek culture to culture. Because right now, mass culture is really strongly associated with a lot of geek culture properties and hobbies, and to me, that's sort of the triumph of the strength of the community that was built in the stores that nurtured the people that are now producing movies and acting in movies and creating new television shows and creating new merchandise. All of that culture grew out of the comic stores and the game stores. And so it's definitely a win for that community because it just got bigger and bigger.
That is for sure. And now, a word from our sponsor. Yo, everybody. I'd like to take a minute to talk about our sponsors over at Impact Theory Comics. Impact Theory Comics is a new independent publisher, and they're releasing their first comic, Neon Future. Neon Future is a collaboration with world-famous DJ and producer Steve Aoki, and is written by the Eisner Award-winning writer of Justice, Jim Kruger, with artists Neil Edwards of Fantastic Four fame and Jeremy Rappak delivering the visuals and building the world. Want a first look at the book and Neil and Jeremy's art? Give Impact Theory a follow on Instagram at IT Comics. If you like what you see and you're a fan of science fiction, this might be the comic for you. So head over to your local comic book shop and get Neon Future #1 on your pull list ASAP. And now, back to the show. Well, let's move into today. I really wanted to have you on the show to talk about where the comic industry is now, and I wanted to start with the direct market. You ran a piece from Phil Boyle at Coliseum of Comics, a big retailer chain in Southeast the United States, on your site, and it was a very interesting piece. It was Phil talking about where retail is what he's going to do in response to it, like eight different key points of what's happening, what he's going to do, and what he'd like his distribution and publisher partners to do. It's a very fascinating piece, but it kind of underlines, especially in concert with like a recent piece by Brian Hibbs, what Chuck Rosansky has been saying, that the direct market is in a really weird place. What's your read on the current state of the direct market right now?
Well, I think there's multiple factors in play, and one of them is something that I talked about earlier in this conversation, which was it's not always easy to find the magic, and it just feels like the last couple of years the creative spark hasn't been as strong as it was the few years before that. Walking Dead was a huge phenomenon, and that's sort of on the downslope, and Saga was a huge phenomenon, and that's sort of on the downslope. And neither Marvel nor DC have really been doing stuff that fans want to buy in big numbers or that is bringing in new fans. So I think that's a big part of it. Then I think there's a few things that are of maybe broader concern. There's that cyclical part of the business that's just, are people creating stuff that a lot of readers want to read? And that's sort of weak right now. Then on the sort of structural side, the kind of things that Phil was talking about, if you go through those 8 things, some of them are things I've been hearing from retailers for 40 years. So, I don't have enough margin. Well, that's a constant battle, right? Who gets the margin? The retailer, the publisher, the distributor. But there's some things in there that are a matter of greater concern, and that's the things that reduce predictability. The first 4 things on his list are pretty much all about things that reduce the predictability for a retailer. Direct market was built on a new concept at the time, which was if the retailer is really smart and they know what's going to sell, they can order the right quantity and they don't have to make returns. And that direct market distribution system replaced a system where nobody knew what was going to sell. They just threw it out on the racks and they returned to the publisher the portion that didn't sell. It was very inefficient. Direct market was very efficient, but it's based on retailers being able to predict what sells. Well, when there's as many variants as there are core books, and when there are very, very few continuing series, a title like Captain America, you know that number 199 is going to sell about the same as number 198 or whatever. And now every series pretty much starts over every few years. There's a lot of mini-series. There's a lot of huge events. All of those things kind of disrupt that predictability. And to a degree, that's manageable. You can look at, well, here's the creator and here's the concept, and now I kind of know how many to order of this. But when there's so many variables, it's just too hard. And over the last year and a half or so, retailers that I talked to have really focused in on that problem, that it's just getting harder and harder to predict what sells. And when that happens, there's a couple of results. One is their gross margins go down. And by that, I mean the difference between what they spend on product and what they bring in on sales shrinks. So they buy 100 comics and they sell 90 of them, and they were each $1. They bought them at 50% off. They paid $50, and their sales were $90. Maybe they threw 10 away, or they put them in the quarter bin or whatever. And their margin was $40. Well, if suddenly they only sell 70 or 80 of those dollar comics, then their margin is only, $20 or $30 out of $70 or $80. The percentage goes down. So that's hard to make up. Costs are going up, payroll's going up, rent's going up, all those costs are increasing. So when gross margin goes down, the retailers have a much tougher problem to solve in terms of how to make enough money to support their costs. And then the result is they order less, they order more conservatively, and then it makes it harder for new things to gain a foothold. When people do come up with that next great idea, is it going to get enough of a foothold in stores to actually, get the launch velocity it needs to become successful? So that's a really potentially damaging problem, and I think there's too much right now. It's making it too hard for retailers to figure out what to order. And then the other thing I'd comment about is there's some thought out there. We had a column on our site by Paul Levitz, who ran DC Publishing for many years. And he asked the question, are people now getting enough of their superhero itch scratched, in movies and television, they don't need comics as much anymore to fill that part of their entertainment. And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's certainly a question we should be asking ourselves and trying to figure out if that's the case or not. Because if it is, then we have to focus on other genres and things that maybe aren't as popular in mass media in order for the comics medium itself to be successful.
Mm-hmm. That's a question that's come up quite a bit, and I've been kind of fascinated by it, but I tend to think that it's probably not the case, just because, I mean, first off, they're different forms, and second off, they're just, there's so much more of the comic product. Like I don't know if like watching Arrow on the CW is going to offset a person's desire to buy a Green Arrow comic if they're a huge Green Arrow fan. It's such a big concept that it's almost kind of like impossible to really ascertain whether or not it's true. But I did want to ask about two other things involving, I don't remember if these were on Phil's list, but there's two other things I was curious about. One is frequency of release. Like there's a lot of weeklies these days. Like Uncanny X-Men itself either is about to finish or has already finished its first 10 issues, all of which were weekly releases. And weekly releases are extremely difficult to order on, because if you buy issue number one, by the time issue number one comes in and goes through its like first week of sales, you're going to have already, because of FOC, you're going to have, I think, issue 4, even up to issue 4 would have already been past FOC, maybe even just issue 3, but still a long ways. And because non-returnability, it's like you don't want to order too deep. There's plenty of bi-weekly comics that do roughly the same thing. How do you feel like that approach impacts the potential sales viability of a lot of these books?
Well, just one more thing, reducing predictability. So it sort of fits in that same bucket because it adds more issues to the group that it's hard for a retailer to figure out how many to order, and it increases their risk because if they guess wrong on the first one, they've guessed wrong on the first 4 or more. So I think it's part of that same bucket of problems. I think there's some pluses to weeklies. Like DC had sort of taken a strategy of we're not going to have as many Batman titles. We're going to increase the frequency on our Batman titles. And they tried that. I think that sort of, makes some sense, and it creates a greater likelihood that the same customer might buy that title instead of only buying one of the two. So it has some potential positive impact on sales. But overall, I guess it's something that I think that should be used carefully. You see it being successful in other countries. In Japan, obviously, there are weekly magazines that do really well and have survived over long periods of time. Most of those are anthologies, that have kind of a mix of material in them, and like a lead feature that's really popular and on TV, and some other things they're experimenting with, and a few others that are kind of in between. So that may be the best format for a weekly because it's got multiple things to sustain it, and running that same weekly, I don't know how long Shonen Jump's been published, but it's been running for a long time, so it's relatively predictable, as opposed to we're going to do a weekly and it's going to run for 4 issues. You got one shot to get it right. That's tough.
Yeah, I've had a couple of people suggest to me that why does Marvel or DC not really have a Shonen Jump type product? And I guess you could say that the Walmart Giants are kind of like a Shonen Jump type product, except for some of most of the stories are reprints. But it is kind of interesting that's never been a model that's been really seemingly looked at. Most of the weeklies are, I don't know. I think one of the problems with the weeklies too is a great example of a weekly that really worked was 52 when DC published 52. A big part of that though is the fact that was an extremely good comic that was run by some very top names, and the rest of the weeklies, I would say, by and large, are an extreme mixed bag, which makes it really hard to predict orders off of because you just don't know if A, these are going to be important, or B, if they're going to be good.
Yeah, I think there's another factor which, when I was in distribution, I sort of came up with this rule of thumb, which is that Americans don't like anthologies as much as they do in some other countries. And in other countries, they look at an anthology and say, what's the thing in this that I really want to have? And
Right.
Americans look at it like, what's the thing in this that I really don't want? And so they end up not buying it because there's one thing in it they don't want, whereas in some other countries, they will buy it because there's one thing in it they do want. So it's just a difference in the American taste and probably history. There just haven't been that many comic anthologies here, so people are used to them.
Yeah, it's definitely a different format. But, I wanted to ask, one of the pro articles you wrote recently on ICv2 was about, graphic novel crisis in comic book stores. And I did want to ask about, like, the biggest thing facing comic shops right now, what the biggest problem affecting the direct market is. Do you think it's that graphic novel crisis, or do you think it's something else?
Well, I think the graphic novel crisis is part of something I've been talking about for a couple of years, which is just the risk that comic stores lose their importance or lose their relevance. And I wrote another column about that, longer ago. But the basic concept there was that in the 80s, when the direct market was taking over comic distribution from newsstand distributors and newsstand outlets, it wasn't that those places stopped selling comics. It was just that they were shrinking, comic stores were growing, comic stores were more profitable. That was where the excitement was. Publishers started producing comics for comic stores, and so the content changed, and that steered the whole business more toward comic stores. And I fear the same thing happening in the opposite direction now, because the growth is in graphic novels. It's not in periodicals. It's in the kind of graphic novels that are not as popular for comic store audiences, primarily things for female and younger readers, and that's not an audience that comic stores have been as successful with in the past. So if comic stores don't get good at those categories, I fear that their share of the business continues to shrink, that publishers continue to produce more for those other channels like the book channel and online that are growing and that are serving those kinds of audiences, the female and younger reader audiences better, and that all ends up in a situation where comic stores become less and less important, publishers produce less and less content directed at that audience, and we risk losing that source of community, which I think has been really, really important in growing the medium.
Mm-hmm. It's funny that you talk about the women and young readers audience, because I actually specifically underlined a quote you had in Comic Shop, Dan Garino's book, where you said that the biggest force affecting comic stores right now is the demographic diversification and taste diversification of the audience. You've got women in sort of unprecedented numbers reading comics. We haven't seen this gender mix, I think, since the early 50s. I mean, that's only, I think, accelerated since you said that, because that was, I think the book came out in 2018 or 2017, and you probably, that interview was probably well before then, but it feels like that's only gotten bigger, especially with people like Dav Pilkey's, having print runs of like 5 million copies of his latest Dogman book.
Yeah, definitely. It's accelerated since then. And unfortunately, most of that growth is happening in the book channel. So that's a problem for
comic stores. Yeah. I do want to ask you some specific questions in relation to some of the specific publishers. Like, Marvel is a really interesting publisher to me in a lot of ways. They're easily focused on, but there's a lot of reasons for that. The biggest thing that kind of has stood out to me is that they have seemingly, in my opinion, kind of punted certain markets. Like their kids' books, they've kind of just pushed off to IDW and said, do something with this. The book market, as we talked about a little bit before we start recording, like I moved over to Marvel Unlimited primarily for catching up with books that I didn't read in single issues, because their book program, their trade paperbacks are just poor quality and overpriced, in my opinion. It kind of feels like they've punted both the book market and kids books almost entirely. Why do you think that is? Or do you think I'm off base in saying that?
Well, I think they just have a little different strategy in the book market than DC or some other publishers. You mentioned you think they're low quality and overpriced. Well, I think they sort of view them as periodicals.
Sure.
And we're going to put this out on the market for a certain period of time. Whatever doesn't sell, we're going to move on to the next thing. And that ends up producing that kind of format and that kind of pricing. They've got some waste at the end because they're not keeping them in print for long periods of time. They have to remain to the ends of the runs. and so they need better margins on the front end. So I think they just have a different strategy. I don't have access to the internal financial results for Marvel and DC to figure out whose strategy is more profitable. To me, it's better for the business to have stuff in print for a longer period of time, but that's not the way they choose to do it for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as younger readers go, there is an exception to that, which is the Marvel Rising line,
right,
which is sort of a little bit older, but it's still kids, still under 18. And they're doing something that DC sort of pioneered with Superhero Girls, where introduce the IP with some videos, and then do comics and merch later. And so they're sort of pursuing that audience, which is older than the audience, I think, for the IDW stuff. So they're not totally abandoning that part of the business, but I think they're trying to focus on the parts they feel like they can do best.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense when you think about, like, maybe they just don't have the staff that has the expertise in those varying fields, but it just seems like it's a really interesting time for them to, they still continue to embrace the varying variant cover frustrations that for shops, like the order gates and meter exceed and everything like that, and like embracing weeklies and doing all the things that kind of frustrate people, while they're not really serving the markets that seemingly the boom resides in. Which just, I understand why they do. Maybe they just don't have the people for it, but it seems like those are the types of things you want to move towards rather than kind of doubling down on the audience you already have.
Yeah, I think it sort of reflects the pull inside the companies and in the business at large between this older type of audience, which is primarily adult and teen males, on which the business was built. And then there's this new part of the business that's coming up and growing now. And you don't want to lose that old part of the audience because that's what you built your business on, and it's still there, and you still make money on it. But you also want to, expand to this new business. I think there's just a lot of conflict internally and in the business as a whole over how do we keep that old audience and serve the new audience. And I think, every retailer has to face that same quandary. How do I keep all of my existing customers but find these kids and women that are, shopping at bookstores in bigger numbers? Don't want to turn off my old customers because the first thing they see when they walk in the store is a kid's book, and then they think it's not their store anymore. But I also want the parents that walk in to see the kid's book the first thing they walk in because they're going to buy it. So it's a really tough problem to hang on to that old audience and build a new one at the same time, and I think Marvel is struggling with that.
Yeah. One of the things that really I've had a lot of conversations with Brian Hibbs over the years, Comics Experiences, Brian Hibbs. And one of the things that really stood out to me is how he really doesn't need any more books that sell like 5 or 6 copies. He needs more 100 comics that sell like 100 copies. Do you, this might be hard to say, but do you feel like, can the market sustain as many comics and publishers it like currently has? Because it feels like, for Marvel, for example, they have so many books that they're releasing that it kind of makes it hard for any of them to really hit big. It's like they have a lot of minor hits, but nothing that can really dominate. And it feels like the industry needs more of the big ones rather than the small ones.
Well, you see that in every form of entertainment these days, right? I mean, there's almost 500 scripted television shows.
Right.
That making it harder for a single television show to get a big audience like they used to when there were only 4 networks. I think that's definitely true. It's just the overall market's bigger. It's more segmented. At the same time, there's still a graphic novel out there that just printed 5 million copies. Yep. So there is a way to get a mass audience if you get the right, if you get the magic.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's more of a cyclical issue where the content right now isn't just what's grabbing a big percentage of the market. I don't think that's necessarily a change in the market. I think it's just the content's not that good right now.
Mm-hmm.
Good in the sense of selling a lot of copies, which, as I said earlier, that's how I evaluate things. Good is as good sells. That's one of Milton's aphorisms.
It's not a qualitative statement. It's just it's not connecting, I guess.
Right. Not hitting the audience in a way that makes them want to buy it.
That is, I do think that, you mentioning TV is a good example. I always kind of, I always say like peak comics, because I feel like we have TV and comics have a lot of overlap right now, because there's so many different ways you can be served on both of them. There's so many different programs and comics you can read that it's hard for any of them to sell a whole lot. And in like, you look at TV, like the only things that really get gigantic ratings on a consistent basis is sports. Like NFL games have massive ratings, but there's no MASH finale anymore. There's no Seinfeld finale anymore. It's just like okay numbers really kind of across the board. I don't know if there's really a way to put that genie back in the bottle. Do you?
Well, Walking Dead, which at its peak, which was not that long ago, if I'm remembering right, was getting like 20 million people an episode with the delay, and that's a big audience.
Yeah.
Yes, it's less than 10% of the number of people in the United States, but it's still 20 million people. That's a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I think it's more a matter of just hasn't been something that has connected with people in the same way that Walking Dead has since.
Sure. And now, a word from our sponsor. Yo, everybody. I want to take a quick break to talk about my friends at Radio vs. the Martians. Mike Gillis and Casey Doran host the Radio vs. the Martians podcast, a show that gathers their funniest, smartest friends once a month for a deep dive into science fiction, video games, horror, comics, movies, and everything in between. So far, they've dissected topics like Superman, Steven Spielberg, Akira, George Lucas, zombies, Twin Peaks, Hayao Miyazaki, James Bond, Watchmen, and whether drivers are required to pull over for the Ghostbusters. Find this podcast and its spin-off show, Podcast La Vista, baby, a celebration of the films of thespian and statesman Arnold Schwarzenegger, on iTunes, Stitcher, and at radioversusthemartians.com. And now, back to the show. So this week there was some big news came out from DC. There was layoffs there, and the biggest name to me was John Cunningham, who's been there for a while, who works in their I'm trying to remember what his title is, Senior VP of Trade Sales Marketing, I want to say. And
yeah.
And I've met John. He's a great guy, very smart guy, and to me, like I was at Comics Pro last year at the annual summit, or annual meeting in Portland, and everyone loved him. Everyone thought it was a brilliant man who brought a lot to it. It seemed like a very interesting move to me, especially with all the stuff that's happening with Black Label seemingly kind of disappearing, and with, I don't know, it just kind of feels like there's some wavering support in their imprint approach. Like in Pam Lifford's write-up about the people departing, she mentioned how she was planning, getting back to super serving their existing audience. Do you kind of feel like there's a shift going on at DC right now in their approach, moving away from those imprints, or is it just too hard to tell right now?
I can't tell. I think with Cunningham, he was a book guy. He came out of the book business. He was really great at that channel. I don't know what the bench is like behind him. Ski came out of I don't know exactly what his title is, but he's handled newsstand and direct market, and so he sort of came out of that space. So I don't know who's going to be handling the book channel, but I think I guess I would compare it to the Packers' recent coaching change, which was they fired Mike McCarthy, who took him to the Super Bowl and won, but the team's not winning. So, and right now DC is not doing well in the book channel and not doing well overall. I think the shakeup in sales marketing, part of that is and they're trying to figure out who is our market, why aren't we connecting with them, and what can we do differently? And to do that, you change people, even if they've had big success in the past, which I think John has.
Mm-hmm. What is your take on their kind of imprint approach? Because I actually found it quite appealing, because I feel that one of the things about where we are as a society is that we're much more splintered in what we do and don't like in terms of media. Like whether that means format or content or whatever, you have to you look at the Netflix approach. Netflix has a million different shows, all of wildly different quality and all of wildly different lengths and, genres and everything like that. They're trying to serve everybody. And to me, the imprints felt like DC both trying to experiment and see what works, but also trying to serve a broader audience in a way that might please them in a better way. Like, what's your take on that? Do you feel like that was a smart move or continues to be a smart move, or is it just too early to tell on that?
Well, it's part of that struggle between how do we keep the old customers happy and how do we get our new customers? And
Right.
part of that is, what does our brand mean? Does DC mean those comics for teen and young adult males, or does it mean something broader? And the imprints help them identify for consumers those things that maybe aren't for that teen and young adult male audience and are for these newer audiences they're trying to attract. So I think it's a good idea. I think it's a positive sign of support for those new audiences and a way to identify those products. So they can go to a retailer maybe that serves women better than men and say, well, this is our line for you. Or they can go to a kid's venue and say, here's our line that serves you, and we've got a separate imprint for it. We're really supporting it. I think all that is good at the trade level.
Yeah, I'm still very hopeful for Ink and Zoom. I have no idea where they're at yet. I mean, like, honestly, like the books, I don't even know if the first book comes out until June, but I'm still hopeful for it because I think that that's a very smart play by them.
Yeah, and you see, and Marvel's sort of taken the other approach, which is Marvel is going to mean, that core audience, which they've expanded successfully. They've had, books that have had broad appeal to women and some of these newer consumer groups, but they're sort of sticking more with the Marvel brand on most things other than Marvel Rising, and just saying we're going to focus on that core audience, try to expand that as much as we can. Whereas DC is sort of saying, there's a difference between the core and the rest of the audience, and we're going to identify the differences. So different approaches, it'll be interesting to see what works. So much of it will still come back to, do the creators make things that people want to buy?
Mm-hmm.
And the creative environment is sort of separate from that marketing environment.
I do think it's interesting, though, because as much as I said that Marvel has not been successful in the book market and kids, by and large, it seems like books like Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur and like The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, even to a certain degree, have both managed to survive and even thrive thanks to markets like the Scholastic book fairs. And like those channels, I don't know why those channels weren't bigger to begin with, but it is interesting that those books are doing well, seemingly or allegedly, from what I understand, in Scholastic book fairs, but maybe not elsewhere.
Well, there's something like Black Panther or Ms. Marvel, which had good legs in the comic market, but really found a new market in the bookstores and did really well there.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's just related to some of those stuff for younger readers either. It's Ms. Marvel and Black Panther both appealed to very different audiences from that core audience that Marvel has had in the past. Black Panther more appealing, obviously, to African American readers, and got a big boost from the movie, but was doing well before that. They brought in sort of a celebrity writer with Ta-Nehisi Coates, and were able to create something that did capture a new and different audience. And same with Ms. Marvel, which I think appealed to a different audience, and an audience of women to a greater degree than past Marvel stuff. So they have been successful in the book channel with some of those as well, and they did well in the comic stores too, but just not as didn't blow up as much as they did in the book channel.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like the book market is becoming a bigger focus than ever for traditionally direct market focused publishers?
Yes, yeah, and as I was saying, I think that's kind of the scary thing for comic stores. If I'm working on the end of the year stuff for 2018, and we don't have the numbers yet, but the lines, if you draw on a graph, comic market or direct market sales and book channel sales, they're getting ready to cross. And when that happens, then, all bets are off in terms of what publishers make, because they're going to look at the place where they sell the most books, and they're going to decide what to publish based on that.
Yeah.
Greater degree they have in the past.
I mean, even you look at somebody like Image, and Image has been moving a fair amount of their single issue series have moved over to now direct to graphic novels / trade paperback releases. They seemingly have been releasing more straight graphic novels than they have in the past. And it seems like they're kind of shifting their focus on the format for their comics in a way that I don't remember. And maybe I'm just forgetting part of Image's past, but it does seem like they're kind of changing their focus on their content in a way that they didn't have before?
I think all those mid-sized publishers are doing more OGNs than they have in the past. And that's sort of the flip side of what we were talking about with Phil Boyle, which is the periodical market. It isn't just tough for retailers. It's really tough for publishers. The reason they're doing all these variants and stuff and returnability and different periods between issues, they're trying all these things because the periodical market is really tough and it's really hard to break through. So that's happening at the same time as the graphic novel market is growing. Get away from the part that's a pain in the butt and go to the part of the market that's growing. That's a perfectly rational business decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've had Heidi McDonald on my show several times, and I think 2 times ago she made a line, and I think she's been saying this for years, but she thinks that the floppy format is dying, the periodical format is dying, and I hemmed and hawed about that. But do you think that the comic book medium is moving past the floppy as the dominant format, or do you think that's it'll always have a place?
Well, periodicals, and we talked at the beginning of this conversation about some of the ways comics is like other businesses, and here's a place where comics are like other businesses. Periodicals are shrinking as a medium, and that's happening across every kind of category. And part of that is just the alternatives. The internet is a great way to distribute periodical or short-lived content, and people get more of that kind of content there. And distribution is shrinking for periodicals. There's fewer magazine racks. Magazine racks are smaller. So all of those, and advertising support for print publications, including comics, is also shrinking. So I think that's just part of a larger trend, and I think it would be surprising if comics were able to buck that trend because they're unique features. I don't think it means they're going away, but just as magazines aren't going away. But it's changing, and there's certainly more growth in the book format than the periodical format overall. And that's true of comics too.
I'm the worst millennial in the world. I still love the periodical format. I don't know if it's nostalgia or if it's just I prefer it, but I love reading comics in single issue floppy format, and like I get an omnibus and I try to read it in bed and it crushes me to death. And it's like, I don't know, the floppy format just works for me. I don't know why that is. My own reading, I've pretty much moved away from floppies, and part of that is just, I don't know, time constraints or whatever. It feels more like a better use of time to sit down and be able to read a complete story. Sure.
So, and I've sort of gotten past, I've got to be the first one to read this, so that gives me time to wait till something comes out in trade if I'm interested in a new periodical title. So I'm sort of following the overall trend there, I guess.
I think that you've said about how like the quality isn't there in terms of sales. And I think part of that comes with what you're saying about that emergent need to read this comic as soon as it comes out. I kind of feel like it's been a bit since we've had that comic, that Marvel or DC comic that has a lot of heat, where there's that conversation behind it. Like, I'm trying to think of what the last event comic where people really felt like that was. I remember when Civil War was coming out, and it was like there was this fervent desire for, this comic came out and I got to talk about it immediately. I don't know if that conversation is happening as much with the current stuff that's coming out.
Well, there's so many attempts to generate that kind of buzz, so many events and so many reboots and so many new series. So when there's 100 things trying to accomplish that every month, it's harder for one to break through, as you've said in the earlier part of this conversation. So yeah. I think part of it just how many there are, but it's also creative. We just haven't hit it. I don't know. For the first few issues, it seemed like Doomsday Clock was sort of, getting that kind of buzz, and then the period between issues started getting longer, and it sort of died off. So there hasn't been anything that certainly sustained it for any period of time.
Mm-hmm. I also think another interesting thing with floppies is I've been trying to get somebody lined up on my podcast for this, just because I find it to be really interesting. But I kind of feel like the current releases it's like collectability to a certain degree is dying. Like most of the collectors I know or follow online are almost exclusively trading in 90s and before comics. It's like the real passion and collectability is kind of dead with modern comics unless something really unless like something like Into the Spider-Verse comes out. Then all of a sudden people want to get Spider-Gwen's first appearance and Miles Morales' first appearance. It's really current stuff is only really driven in collectability by adaptations almost.
It does seem that way. And again, part of it's when you're trying to create 100 or 200 collectibles a month with variant covers and first issues, how can any one be truly collectible? There's just too many.
Yeah.
So the only collectible action I see, things that get driven by adaptations, but also variants. One particular cover will get hot, and it'll end up on the app, and people will start to try to seek that out. But I don't think that has any. Can't drive the market long term that way.
No.
Not related to content. The kind of collectability that we were used to in the past was, a new artist starts this, or writer or both start this run, and all of a sudden, it's a story that really captures the imagination. Everybody wants the first issue in that run, and maybe they created a new character, and then so it was all creatively driven, and now it's sort of artificially driven in a lot of ways, and I think that sort of dilutes the overall power of collectability.
Yeah, and I also think to a certain degree all the reboots and everything affect that too, because it used to be special to have the first issue of Amazing Spider-Man, but now that there's been like 6 volumes of Amazing Spider-Man, it's not quite as special.
Exactly. Well, that goes back to what I was talking about earlier too, about the predictability of the market. When a title is long running and there's hundreds of issues, and it's just when the new arc starts or new character gets introduced or whatever, it's a more predictable sale, and those unusual events are more unusual. But now they're not unusual anymore. They're happening every day.
I one time called Marvel the boy who cried reboot. And I at the time I felt kind of mean, but I was like, I actually think that's kind of accurate. Like it seems like they've kind of had diminishing returns with all of that to a certain degree. But I do want to ask about digital, because that's one of the things I think is really interesting about.
Can I say one other thing about that?
Sure.
I think part of this is driven by the fact that comic books are a very cheap form of entertainment, and so there's not a lot of market research. So the way publishers do research is they just keep doing it until it stops working. And I've had publishers say that to me. I had Dan Buckley say that to me in an interview. And that means that it leans toward excesses, right? So because they just keep doing it until it doesn't work anymore. And that means at some point they're doing too much and it stops working. So it's just sort of the nature of the beast, because comics are cheap.
It is, the interesting thing though is it kind of feels like in the aughts, in like the 2000 to 2008 range, it feels like Marvel, especially because it was coming off of like the bubble bursting in comics and everything like that, it felt like Marvel had kind of done away with a lot of their bad habits. And then like something hit. It was like once they had success with I'm trying to remember what the first big variant cover after David Gabriel came on was, but once he brought those on, it was just like the floodgate was open, and next thing you know, we have all these variants, and that's not me blaming David Gabriel, but it is kind of interesting where it kind of felt like it was very content driven in the aughts, and then in this decade, it's become much more gimmick driven in a lot of ways.
Right. Yeah, they'll keep doing more and more until it stops working, with whether that's reboots or first issues or miniseries or variants, all of those things that are driving that unpredictability. They're going to keep doing it until retailers stop ordering it. And as we've been seeing the last couple of years, that's happening to some degree.
Yeah. So digital. In your little the things that you do every year with Comic-Con, is that I'm trying to remember what you call it. Is it the white paper, or is
that's separate? I sometimes do a white paper with comic sales information in it, but we just do an annual market size estimate at the end of every year.
Oh, okay. So one of the things I think is really interesting in that is how for a while it seemed like digital was moving upwards, but now it's been kind of plateaued at 90 million. And, I think most people would think that digital is something that would continue to rise. And I know that it's gotten a little bit noisier because there are things like Marvel Unlimited, and there's other services where there's subscription services that you don't have access to information on. But why has it seemingly plateaued? Do you have any feel for that?
Well, same thing happened in books. It happened at a higher percentage. I think it got up to about 30% of the trade book business. digital, and then it stopped growing and even shrank a little bit. And part of that is catalog. When digital first came along, publishers put a lot of their old catalog on in digital format. People built up a digital library so they could carry that around on their iPhones or their iPads. And then once that was done, the only way for the market to grow is for the amount of new material to grow. So you can say those first few years at 90 million maybe were comprised of a greater degree of catalog sales. Now it's more new material. And I would expect it to grow again. And as you say, the subscription services may be growing. The comicsology approach is very different than the Marvel approach. Comicsology is more of a sampling, windowed type approach.
It's a feeder system. It's a feeder system, basically.
Right. Well, it's a windowed. It's just they put out content there on a window, and then you have to buy it if you want it for a longer period of time. Marvel's is we're going to put a huge amount of our library up here, and you can access it at any time. So there are different approaches. We'll see what percentage of the market that gets. But download to own looks like it's going to be an important part of the market for at least some period of time going forward.
Does your 90 million include Comicsology Unlimited?
No, doesn't include any of the subscription-based stuff. And now that Amazon's in that business bigger through Comicsology and through Amazon, and I forget what they call it, they've got a Kindle program that is subscription-based. So we'll see. That may end up being the tail that wags the dog down the road. But for right now, I don't think it's huge, but I think it's part of the market I wish we could measure.
Yeah, I was kind of shocked. I went on to, because DC just became part of Comicsology Unlimited, I went on, as part of the press release, they said that they're putting a bunch of stuff on Prime Reading as well, which is a free app for, it's an app for people who are Prime subscribers on Amazon. And I went on there and I was genuinely shocked by the stuff that they had on there for free. Like Marvel had the entire Planet Hulk omnibus, which if I bought at the time it came out in print would have been $125 but it's free to read on Prime Reading. And I was just, to me, like I look at something like that
for $120 a year.
Yeah. I mean, it's free to read if you're a Prime member, which has a cost to it. But at the same time, I mean, like that seems like a very big bullet to waste. But at the same time, like maybe I'm massively overrating the audience of Planet Hulk. But anyways, I don't know. It was an interesting it's an interesting thing to be on there just for the Prime side. I could see it being on Comicsology Unlimited because that's comic centric, and it, like I said, it's a feeder system. But Prime Reading, it just kind of seems like something that's thrown on there, and it's a pretty big thing to throw on there. But
it is, and like I say, I think it's a different approach. Marvel is more willing to put more of their content up on these subscription-based services than some other publishers. It'll take time to figure out whether that was a smart thing to do or not.
Yeah,
I don't hear retailers telling me, "Oh, gee, I'm selling less backlist because my customers are all subscribed to Marvel Unlimited."
Right.
I don't hear that, so that tells me either they're not talking about it or it's different people, which is what I suspect is the case. And I don't know that they would have bought the print version if they weren't buying the digital. I think they're new customers.
I did think, one thing from all the recent retailer write-ups that I thought was really interesting was Chuck Rosansky from Mile High Comics basically saying that, I mean, he didn't say it, but he kind of said it, where he effectively looks at current issues as dead on arrival in terms of turning into sellable back issues. And I don't know if that's the quality thing we've been talking about, or if that's something else that's causing that to be the case. But I did think that was really interesting.
Yeah, I think, there's so many ways to get that content that reduces collectability. Then the collectability boils down to, does somebody want to get that first appearance of X, character, storyline, new artist, new writer, whatever. And that's a smaller subset than people that also want to read it.
Yeah.
And that's really that. I mean, you can take that back 20 years to sort of the boom of the graphic novel format, which started collecting this stuff and started breaking down some of those reasons for collectability.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what. I guess I can't really say that I think collectability is dead completely because I actually had a comic book garage sale this summer where I tried to sell off a lot of my back issues. Just like you get enough back issues, and the next thing you know, your entire home office is just filled with comics. And so I had this comic book garage sale, and I had 52 people come over 2 days, which was a lot more than I was expecting. And some of them spent literally hours and would walk out with entire long boxes of comics from the last, 25 years. And it was kind of an interesting insight into seeing how people approach like back issue diving or long box diving today. It's certainly still alive. It's just maybe, I don't know, maybe less visible for somebody like me, I guess.
Were they pickers or readers or collectors?
Primarily readers, actually. There's this one guy who actually came from Barrow, Alaska, which is extremely far away. It is like it's where 30 Days of Night took place. So it was a very famously dark and dreary place. And he just happened to be in town and saw it on Facebook. And he bought just an entire long box worth of books from me. And he just wanted to read it. And it was certainly nothing he was going to be able to resell. There were some collectors, like there were some people that were like looking through specifically to see if they could find like things that they could resell themselves, but primarily it was readers. Yeah.
Well, that's a good sign.
Yeah, it was an interesting experience, that's for sure.
You must have had runs, right?
Yeah. I mean, what you mean, like runs on comics, or like?
Well, meaning. I mean, if it's every other issue of something for reading, that's not very much fun.
No.
You must have had nice runs where you could read a complete story.
I did, yeah. I was actually very pleased to be able to like. Some people were like, yeah, I was thinking about getting some DC stuff. Do you have anything to recommend? And I was like, I'm going to push you towards stuff I really like, but that I now have on Comixology that I can read a little bit easier. And so I was like pushing them towards Jeff Johns' run on Justice Society of America, which is, I really like that book. And it was great. It actually made me feel very happy being able to get people into comics I really like and hope that they would enjoy it. It was kind of the ideal form of a comic book shop, I think, partially in the sense that I only had to do it 2 out of every 365 days.
Right.
So I just have a few more questions. I do want to talk about the broader sense of comics and how everything is doing. What's your take? We've talked about a lot of specifics, but what is your take on the overall health of the industry? Is it a good place? Is it a doom and gloom time? What is it?
It's mixed. There's parts that are the best they've ever been. I think the variety of comics being published and the number and quality, measured my way, of comics for people other than the traditional audience is greater than it's ever been. So that's a really, really positive. I think the growth of comics for young readers is amazing because hopefully some of those people will stay with comics through their entire lifetimes. So that's a huge, huge opportunity for the next 20, 30, 40 years. Those 5 million kids that buy the latest Dogman, maybe they'll buy comics throughout their lifespan, and that would be a huge expansion of the market. Just as we saw a huge growth, I think, in adult women reading comics after the manga boom of the mid-aughts.
Mm-hmm.
So those are really positive, those new audiences. I think we're in the midst of a disruption, and the disruption right now is at retail. I've talked in some of my presentations at New York Comic Con and white papers and so on about, the big disruptions in the business, the graphic novel business, which changed periodical sales, opened up new channels, opened up new audiences. You had the online retail, which was another thing around the beginning of this century that started to impact comic sales dramatically. You had the growth of digital. You had the growth of material for these new customers, and now you're seeing things happening at retail that have the potential to dramatically change the business in the future. And those things are the growth of channels other than comic stores, how publishers are reacting to that with what they're publishing. And I think also you're seeing there's chains out there who have been selling packaged media who are looking around for new stuff to sell, and GameStop being maybe the biggest example of that. I think some 4,000, 5,000 stores in the United States. And their core business of packaged video games is going online. Well, so what are they doing? They're looking at merch, they're looking at tabletop games, and they're looking at comic books. They're testing, I think, right now in about 50 stores, 25 periodical comics. Well, if suddenly there were 4,000 GameStops selling periodical comics, that would be a huge impact on the business. You have Walmart, a mass merchant, carrying periodical comics for the first time in many, many years. So all these things are forces that have the potential to disrupt the business dramatically. I think there's positives that come out of that. The biggest risk is that the comic store could be threatened by some of those changes, and that worries me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely worries me. I know a lot of comic shops that are pretty nervous about the current state of things, especially, I mean, I'm sure you've heard the same things, but like a great example of where the nervousness comes from is a lack of faith in the partners that they work with. For example, DC has long been somebody that shops have loved working with, and they've had a lot of supporters there, like Bob Wayne and John Cunningham, in terms of the direct market. Now Wayne and Cunningham are gone, and by and large, when I talk to shops, they say that basically DC is not communicating anymore with them, and that there's a lot of nerviness there, a lot of like uncertainty, and a certain lack of faith. And I think that type of stuff is really concerning for them, because you have to, a market that's entirely based off of non-returnable product is to a certain degree a faith-based industry. And when you don't have faith in your partner, it makes it pretty tough.
Well, it's sort of a generational change. I mean, the people that built the direct market are aging out. You had Paul Levitz, who sort of supervised the growth of DC and the comic stores through most of his career and nurtured that growth and put people in place that supported it. And now the people are coming from other parts of Warner Brothers and are looking at growth opportunities in other media and digital and book channel and, just looking at a broader range of opportunities, because that's where they've seen growth in recent years. I think there's been somewhat of a generational change at Marvel too. So I think that's part of the overall disruption. You don't have the same people with the same loyalty to that channel that they helped build, because they came in after it was created and sort of took it for granted.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a natural thing. I'm not saying that's, there's any evil intent or whatever. It's just they're reacting to the business as they see it, and weren't part of building it to the point where it is now in the form it is now.
Mm-hmm. I do think one interesting wrinkle to all of this, and I think this is affecting all forms of entertainment, is that this kind of ties into what Paul Levitz commented on your site with, about how like maybe the amount of superhero content out there is impacting comic sales. I actually think that one of the biggest hindrances for everything, not just comics, is just there's so much out there for movies and for TV shows and video games and comics and everything like that, that everything is competing for time. There's a real time cost there, and that makes it really difficult for anything to really boom big, because we're so busy binge watching the latest season of, I don't know, or maybe you're my wife and my sister and I are currently binge watching Game of Thrones again, because we want to get prepped up for the current season or the upcoming final season. Because we're doing that, I'm not reading comics, or my wife's not reading the young adult fiction that she enjoys, or my sister's not watching something else. There's a cost to the time that comes there that people don't really think about in specific relation to comics, but I do think it affects it.
Well, and just how much time people spend on their phones. I mean,
sure,
the hours that people spend on Facebook every day are not available for other forms of entertainment. So there's huge competition for people's time and attention. And as you say, it's not getting any better. Last night I watched episode 11 of season 2 of Jessica Jones. I hadn't finished it yet. I'm still working on it. I don't know how long ago, 6 months or a year ago or whatever, but, and I got away from it, and now I'm going back to it. It's really good, but I just didn't finish it at the time. There's tons of content out there like that in every format. I've got a stack of graphic novels to read. I've got TV shows backed up. There's movies I want to go to. I could sit here and look at comics Twitter for the next 2 hours and not see the same thing twice. So huge competition for people's time and attention, for sure.
Oh, I should send you a picture of my nightstand. I'm pretty sure it's going to break pretty soon, just from the graphic novels and books I want to read. It's my nightstand is having a competition for its own death, basically, right now, because I need to start reading books. Otherwise, it's just going to crumble.
Well, Got it. Better turn off your phone and your TV then.
I've actually made a concerted effort. I caught up on all of my single issue reading this week, and I have made it through, I think, like 4 trades and graphic novels. Then I get into books. Oh my God. I have so many books to read. It's ridiculous. Last question for you, Milton. You know, we've talked about this in general, but what do you have a view of where the industry is heading in like the next year, 2 years? Like, do you think there's any big shifts coming, or like any more, I don't know, consolidation in any sort of way? Or do you think that it's just going to be kind of business as usual and it's just going to be a little awkward as we're figuring things out?
Well, business changes fast. And so I think the idea that everything's going to stay the same is not right, because there's just too many forces pressing toward change, whether they're technological or societal or cultural or whatever. There's just too many things moving toward change. And as I said a couple of minutes ago, I think the big pressure right now is at retail. Who's going to end up with the big share of the comics business? How does that affect publishing, and where does that take the business? So I think it could be anywhere from slightly disruptive to massively disruptive, and we don't know which. All I know is that it's going to look different in 5 years than it does today.
Yeah. I can tell you what, the thing I'm excited about in 2019 is I've been calling 2019 the year of the double Telgemeier, and I can't not imagine that having 2 Raina Telgemeier comics in a single year will not be good for everyone. Even if that's just like kind of like floating something that's being disrupted, still 2 Raina Telgemeier books, very good.
Well, and there's going to be, I think, at least 2 Dogmans also.
Oh my, yeah.
Because they've been putting out a couple of years of those. So yeah, this whole expansion of material for younger readers is not slowing down. It's going to expand. I see more and more publishers announcing more titles, including, what you would have thought of as direct market publishers who are doing more stuff for kids now. Because everybody looks at those numbers and say, if I get a home run, this is more than I've ever made on any product. I got to try to get a home run on the kids' books because those moms are out there buying.
Yeah. And it has been really interesting to see how book publishers have started to get into that. Like, Gina Gagliano starting up Random House Graphic. Like, that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch in 2019. But I don't know. The kids comic boom, it doesn't seem like it really has an end in the future. I mean, that's certainly a hopeful thing because, once they get past those comics, maybe those are going to be the people who make comics, and maybe those are going to be the people who read the comics of tomorrow, or the non-kids comics of tomorrow. So it's going to be interesting to watch them.
For sure. And as I said, when we were talking about the longer-term trends, I think that's the most positive thing, is just that expansion. And it's going to, do things in unpredictable ways. I wouldn't have thought in the mid-aughts that the growth in manga readers might produce something like a hit Wonder Woman movie or a Ms. Marvel that sells well in bookstores down the road. So you don't know exactly where it's going to go. Just because they come into comics one way doesn't mean they stay with that type of material. They develop and change, and something new might capture their imaginations down the road. So all we know is that there's going to be change and that there's big opportunity because of these new consumers, and that's all good.
Mm-hmm. Well, Milton, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about comics and the industry and everything else with me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with Milton Griepp. You can find Milton on his site about the business of geek culture, ICv2. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support it, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to exclusive written and audio content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Stitcher and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find the show on social media by liking it on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD, following it on Twitter at @sketchedcomic, or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Julio Anta, Greg Peterson, Gus, Andrew Scott, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Johan Barander, Paul Reinwand, Connor Farner, Vita Ayala, JDC and Matt Gagnon, Aditya Bidikar, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, Kieran Mark Antonio, WMQ Comics, Akil, Greg Lockhart, Kokachi, Phil White, Ben Becker, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Sevi, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Paletto, Dylan Campbell, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Assey, Adam Bogert, Xavier Files, Maria Schweitzer, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Evan Blazer, Brian McRae, Ira James Udaskin, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bruno Batista, Bobby Angus, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Phil Nall, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Carl McMahon, Chris Palmer, Maxwell Schmidt, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Iovino, Nicholas Kesslake, Greg Rucka, Adam Highfield, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corrigan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track outro from their album Volmilch opens the show. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.